I got started when I was 15 years old up in a school in Concord, New Hampshire, a place called St. Paul's, with a theophilosopher teacher by the name of Reverend John Walker. He taught about Martin Luther King and Howard Thurman and Benjamin Elijah Mays and Gandhi and all of the then very nascent thinking around love, nonviolence, and social activism. He was a big influence on myself, and then about 10 years before me on John Kerry, now the Secretary of State. John Walker was a very popular man, and he convinced me that love is the most significant force in the universe. In 2001 actually, I received a fax of a lifetime from Sir John Templeton, who started the Templeton Funds and is kind of a mega famous investor. He died in 2008. And the fax was really simple. It came down from Nassau in the Caribbean. It said, "Stephen, how would you like to start an institute that doesn't study human disease and human deficit, but rather studies the greatest human asset imaginable?" And I faxed back, "Sir John, that's a great idea. What are we talking about?" And he said, "Unlimited love," by which he meant a love that isn't caught up in pay it back or reciprocal gains or self-interest, but just, you know, love and forget about it, as he used to say to me. And he said that was freeing, and it was the best way to live. It was the healthiest and the happiest way to live. So in my fax, I asked Sir John, what should we call this? His response by fax was, well, how about the Institute for Research on Unlimited Love? And I admit I had a slight moment of white male trepidation, because I thought, what kind of love are we talking about? And here I was in a big, massive academic medical center with the Cleveland Clinic and university hospitals and Case Western. I wondered what my friends were going to say to me about this endeavor. So I faxed back to Sir John, maybe we should call it the Institute for Creative Altruism, because altruism is a more science-y word that's accepted in a lot of research circles. But Sir John had science as well as spirituality and philosophy in mind, so he faxed back rightly, no, I think Unlimited Love, $8.9 million. And I faxed back, Sir John, I love that language, it jumps right off the page. And we were able to fund about 80 studies at universities from Stanford to Stony Brook, from Harvard to the University of Chicago, and really got the deep study of human generosity underway in about 2000, 2001, 2002. And a lot of people have recognized that. So now we still have ongoing projects, and that is my passion. Although I do love being a medical school professor in preventive medicine, because I'm convinced that when people are givers, so long as they don't overdo it and stress themselves out, they live much happier, healthier, and on average, even longer lives, which is absolutely true. There are so many wonderful scientists now who are tired of studying disease and want to study the great human strengths, like forgiveness, gratitude, self-control, kindness, generosity, and ultimately love. I tend to define love with the help of a long since deceased University of Chicago psychiatrist by the name of Harry Stack Sullivan. He said, when the happiness, security, and well-being of another means as much to you and is as real to you as your own happiness, security, and well-being, you love that person. Now look, I'm not drawing on Greek or Hebrew or any kind of difficult language. I'm just saying in common sense terms, that's a good definition. Think about love you might have for a close friend, or maybe love for somebody who's sick in the hospital, or maybe love for your family members, maybe a parent looking down at the crib of a newborn. This kind of idea that the happiness and security and well-being of another means as much and is as real to me as my own pretty much says a lot. And all the great humanitarians, the people like Gandhi or Mother Teresa or Cicely Saunders or Martin Luther King, you know, they all spoke about love. King talked about a love that does justice. So we've studied what happens in the human brain when people just think about helping others. And it turns out if you take people into a laboratory and put a brain scan device on top of their heads, a PET scanner, you give them a menu with 20 or so charities that they might just consider contributing to. When they have a eureka moment, that's what I'd like to give to, a part of the brain lights up. And it's an old, deeply evolved part of the brain. It's called the mesolimbic pathway. Don't write that down, but you can Google it. And it's the part of the brain that doles out feel-good chemicals like dopamine and serotonin, 2 of the 4 happiness chemicals. Of course, serotonin is used to treat depression. So here you have it. You just think about doing good, and your brain releases chemicals that make you feel happier. And this has been replicated, this kind of science. People have been looked at when they're doing face-to-face helping activity like volunteering in a literacy program for kids. It's really pretty exciting. There's also a hormone that the brain releases when we're involved in helping others, especially face-to-face. And this occurs in both men and in women, and it's called oxytocin. Some folks refer to it as the compassion hormone, but interestingly, it's also very strongly associated with trust, with a sense of tranquility, serenity, inner peace. So suddenly you begin to understand some of those old Norman Rockwell pictures on the old Saturday Evening Post covers. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You've got Hindus and Jews and Christians and secular existentialists and people of every color and class. They're all just putting their minds to the question, how can I use my talents to contribute to the well-being of others? And they look so tranquil. Their faces just look at peace. And I think what's happening there is that we're seeing the effects of oxytocin. They're getting their minds also, though, off the self and the problems of the self, the things in life that maybe are bothering them the most. Maybe that resentment, that bitterness, that hostility they have against somebody who did something that was unkind or ungenerous or hurtful 5 years ago, and they just can't shake it. There's no better way to get beyond that kind of destructive emotional state than helping others and then having confidence that with the passing of time, your perspective might broaden a little bit and you could figure out, well, maybe I could have said something a little differently or handled it a little differently than I did. But all that's really powerful stuff. We know that 76% of Americans say that the thing that makes them happiest in life is, quote, contributing to the lives of others. We know that when people volunteer at what are called low thresholds, just a couple of hours a week, volunteer in an area that they find to be meaningful, they have all kinds of benefits. In fact, one of the largest managed healthcare organizations in the United States is called United Healthcare. In the early 2010, they did a study, which I happen to be associated with. They did a national survey of about 5,500 Americans 18 and older. And they asked them, in 2009, did you do any volunteering? Turns out about 41% of Americans volunteered. These are adult Americans. Now, that number, 41%, holds pretty even over the years. You know, sometimes it's 38, 37%, but 40 is just about the number. How much did they volunteer on average? About 100 hours a year, a couple of hours a week. So again, not overdoing it here. And then we asked them questions about what they thought volunteering did for them. 68% said Volunteering made them feel physically healthier. That's kind of like when you get off carbos and have protein for a few days, you just feel a little stronger. And it's actually a very reliable measure of health in medical studies. 96% of the volunteers said it made them feel happier. Now, this is a time when, I'm sorry to say, Americans are lagging behind many other parts of the world in terms of happiness. I think we're down to about 30th now, way behind places like Mozambique, where they may not have as much as we do, but they have more community and they have more pro-social helping tasks that are part of the scope and the expectations of life. So they're embedded in community. They're not just living these isolated, empty lives in a world of affluenza. Nope, they're finding meaning and gratification. So America is not doing too well in the international happiness scales that come out of the University of Lancaster in the UK. And here you have it. People are happier when they help others. That's pretty powerful stuff. I think that you can look at mental health, you can look at depression rates. One of my favorite studies began at the University of Berkeley in California in 1926. It was a, don't write this one down either, a prospective longitudinal study following 300 preteens, that's another way of saying 12-year-olds, right? And from every kind of racial background, every kind of economic class, educational level. The researchers interviewed these 12-year-olds, and they wanted to make get a sense of what made them tick. About 100 of these kids said, well, I want to do something with my gifts to help the world, to make a difference for humanity. And then they followed these kids every 10 years over the entire course of their lives. They do their medical records, they give them interviews, they give them all kinds of scales that test their emotional status. Turns out that the 100 kids who said, well, I want to help the world, they had lower levels of heart disease over the course of their lives, lower levels of diabetes and asthma, which are stress-related. They also had significantly lower levels of depression. And now these folks are actually in their 90s, their late 90s, and of course they're not all alive. But of the people who are alive, which might be about 85 or 87 of them last I heard, about 2/3 of the ones who were alive come from the 1/3 who, as 12-year-olds, said, hey, I want to use my talents to help humanity. And so what that tells you is that if you can think in these terms early on in life, it sheds a kind of protective halo that will follow you your whole life long. We've been studying very actively Alcoholics Anonymous, which is an organization founded in the 1930s for alcoholics. They get together, sometimes even every morning. They have a meeting. They support each other. They give their testimonies about how they're staying dry. We wanted to know how important it was for alcoholics to help other alcoholics. Do they recover faster? Do they recover better? There's actually something called the 12th step in AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, where you help other alcoholics. Drawing on your own experience, drawing on your grassroots knowledge, you become a wounded healer. You help someone else who's experienced your problem. And that gives you a sense of wisdom and insight that probably no professional has.